You're listening to Girls with Grafts, a burn community podcast created by Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors, a leading nonprofit dedicated to supporting the burn community. In this podcast, we'll talk with burn survivors, share resources to help with supporting and improving burn recovery, and discuss how to prevent burn injuries. Here are your hosts, burn survivors and Phoenix Society's marketing team, Amber Wilcox and Rachel Kudlak.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Girls with Grafts. I am Rachel Kudlak. I'm one of the hosts of the show, and today, unfortunately, my lovely co-host, Amber Wilcox, won't be joining us, but that's okay because I have a special guest on today's episode along with one of my colleagues at Phoenix Society as well, who's going to help me out. So before I introduce both of them, let me just quickly thank today's podcast partner. So today's podcast is powered by the Burt Martin Foundation. The Burt Martin Foundation was established to assist those who help others and provide financial support for nonprofit organizations. And we're honored to have the Burt Martin Foundation as a longstanding Phoenix Society partner. So as I mentioned, Amber won't be able to join us, but I am bringing on my colleague, Jill Sproul here. So for those of you who don't know Jill, she has over 30 years of experience in burn care and nursing leadership. I won't read your whole bio today, Jill, but you were, a burn nurse and then a chief nursing officer. And now, when you thought you were going to retire, we brought you on at Phoenix Society as our senior director of programs and services. So thanks, Joe, for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, and I look forward to this session.
Yes. Well, Jill and I will be talking with our lovely guest, Jenny Brandemuehl. Jenny is the author of Forever Fly Free, One Woman's Story of Resilience and the Power of Hope and Love. And that book is coming out this fall, so don't worry, we're going to be talking more about that. So after losing her husband, Mark, to a tragic plane crash and burn injury, Jenny's life took an unexpected turn, one that led her to explore healing, grief, and the deep strength we find in crisis. A former corporate executive turned writer and speaker, she now advocates for families navigating trauma and loss. She'll also be speaking at this year's Phoenix World Burn Congress. Jenny lives in California with her partner, Robert, and is a proud mom to 2 sons. So thank you so much, Jenny, for joining us today.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks, Rachel, and good to see you, Jill.
Yes. Well, Jenny, I know I just read your bio, but I always like to start our shows off if with our guests just telling us a little bit more about themselves. So if you just can tell us a little bit more about who Jenny is and especially a little bit more about your book.
Oh, great. Yeah. So before Mark's accident, Mark and I were both working. He was working in Reno for an environmental sensor company, and I was chief people officer for an education technology company in Santa Clara. We have 2 boys, one who lives in Austin now, but was living with us at the time in between jobs right before the accident. And our younger son, we had just dropped off in Switzerland, in Zurich, to get his master's in robotics. And we were headed towards retirement and had just given notice. And so, in the end, after everything that happened, I went ahead and continued with leaving my company. My second act was going to be a writer, and I had been working on a novel that I started 10 years ago, and was in the middle of doing all this plot restructuring when Mark had his accident. So I was looking forward to a life of living in Lake Tahoe where we were going to retire and have time to write. And Mark was going to, we were going to hike and ski. We were a very outdoors oriented family, very active. We loved to ski. Mark was a double black diamond skier. I do groomed blacks. I don't do the crazy stuff like he does, like down the chutes. And we love to hike and love to entertain, love to cook, love to travel. We were a real, get out there and do stuff couple. And I would say that's still who I am, though I don't like cooking as much as I've discovered Mark did, especially when a lot of friends come over and I can't quite multitask talking to people and cook at the same time. He was very good at doing both. So I often did the prep and he ran around and talked to people while he cooked. But I still live in Northern California with my partner, Robert. My son, as I mentioned, moved to Austin after the first few years after Mark died. And I pretty much spend my time now working on writing articles about personal resilience and the continued journey. I mean, when you write a book, it only captures a certain window of time in your life, and then more happens. And so life is very dynamic and evolving. And so I've had many more topics around healing, continued healing, and personal growth that I continue to write about. So,
yeah, no, that's great. And I know, you talked a little bit about kind of who Mark was and who you were before the accident. And, Jill and I had the pleasure of reading your memoir already, but you really start off, the book about, that phone call from the hospital and how, that was a life-changing moment for you. Kind of what do you take us back to that day, if you could, and kind of just what was going through your mind? What do you remember most about those early days?
Yeah. I mean, certainly the day I got the call, I hadn't expected that. I was at a conference room meeting with some people, and when that phone rang, I didn't even recognize the area code. And I thought, oh, it's probably just someone trying to sell me something. So I honestly didn't even pick up because I didn't recognize the number. But then it kept on persisting. And so I thought, well, gee, I should just pick it up, because I realized Googling that it was a Phoenix area code, and I knew Mark was flying out of Phoenix that day. And so, of course, when I picked up, first of all, I was shocked it was Mark, because I found out later he was calling me from Burn Center ER in Arizona. And knowing kind of the injuries that he had sustained, I kind of can't believe that he even had the presence of mind to call me. But he just sort of said, something's happened to the plane. I've been in an accident, and I'm in for a long recovery. And then he handed me over to his doctor. And I didn't understand a word the doctor said. I mean, he was just telling me all this technical stuff and or medical stuff, and he couldn't even tell me what happened to the plane. It was just so out of context, right? And so the bottom line was, I asked him, look, are his injuries life-threatening? That's all I need to know. And he said, absolutely. And so then I knew I had to swing into action. And that was when I had to just get the first flight to Phoenix as best I could, knowing that I might be there for a while. And my son helped me pack and kind of get the flight arranged. And that's how I got to Phoenix. And by the way, I think when I've talked to other people who've been through this, they'll forever remember in their memory the day they heard about an accident or a tragedy, or when it happened to them, if they remember.
Definitely. And Jill, I'm curious from, your side of being a former burn care professional, obviously working with, patients and survivors, but not only that, you're supporting families and, care systems who, are going through some of the most traumatic moments of their life. Do you have any advice for, our healthcare professionals who are listening, who, have to make those calls, or, especially in those early days of recovery, how they can best support their support systems?
Yes. And you mentioned it, we're treating the whole family. And so, the bedside nurses need to focus on the patient, but there's other team members that can really help support the family, especially in those critical moments. And I think just meeting the family where they are, listening, being very supportive. And I say supportive in a broad term because support can mean listening, being that person to just sit with them, maybe not have the answers. Also being flexible, which I know in the hospital setting can be very difficult, but we do have some wiggle room. And whether it's visiting hours or letting, someone be with their loved one. So I think really listening to the wants before they become needs, and as a nurse manager for 20 years, often my job was to help with the family so the nurses could do the fluid resuscitation, all the things that they need, life-saving measures. I think also what was so key, and I really tried to practice this and preach this, is empathy and compassion. And sometimes that gets lost in healthcare because it is a really hard job. But I used to tell the nurses, you might be having a bad day, but I guarantee you that patient in the bed and that family member is having the worst moment of their life. And just reminding people, because people will never forget kindness and they will always remember if you're rude, dismissive. And so I think creating that healing environment consistently.
Mm-hmm. That's really great advice. And Jenny, I know in your book too, you talk about, you really open up about how you're trying to protect your sons, manage logistics of Mark's healing and, just barely holding on for your own mental and emotional well-being. So how did you balance, or how did you learn to balance, all those, different areas, taking care of Mark and supporting him and also protecting your sons and your family?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think because of my professional training, having been a leader of teams, that I think I just sort of put that hat back on. Mark was, and this is what's so hard, I think, about burn trauma, is that your loved one is he's in in this case, medically induced coma. And Mark was in a coma pretty much and not very conscious and able to speak for about 4.5 months out of the 5. I only got to talk to him the last 2 weeks when they put a tracheotomy in his throat and they could wean him off some of the sedatives. And so I think I felt like I had to be strong for him. I had to be his advocate. I had to make all the medical decisions with the professionals. And so I really felt like I couldn't let him down, that I had to be strong. And I also wanted to protect my boys. They were 25 and 23. And I think what was hard about that was I lost my father when I was 23. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I don't ever want my kids to go through what I went through. And my dad died very abruptly from a stroke in the middle of the night. And I wasn't home when it happened. And so I felt pretty strongly about that. But what they surprised me with was how mature they could be and how they could rise to the challenge at their age. My younger one proved to be the most practical help to me. He took a leave from school. He spent 4 out of 5 months with me, going to the hospital every single day, driving when I was tired and didn't get enough sleep, running interference sometimes with the nurses and the therapists about things, and absolutely weighing in on all the medical decisions. He was just really wonderful and there by my side. And he always, what I learned about him was he kind of knew about 2 seconds before I was about to have a breakdown that I was about to have a breakdown. And he would suddenly hold my hand or he'd touch my back or something. And I thought it was like he had a sixth sense. And maybe that developed because of what we went through. We really bonded, right, as family. My older son, who was coming in and out visiting from California because he was looking for a job, he couldn't come and stay. It was harder for him. He's an introvert, and he just did not know how to handle the fact that his dad was unconscious the entire time. And so one of the things I said to the boys and the family and our friends is, I really believe that our loved ones, even in a coma, can feel our energy in the room. And I hadn't thought of that except for when a friend told me that when his mom was in a coma and his sister came to visit, she was always really frantic and agitated. And when she woke up from the coma, she said she felt that energy. She didn't know who it was coming from, but she felt it. And so he encouraged me that whatever we could do to create just a feeling of love and support and peace for Mark, that could really help him heal. And so with Wesley, what I did was I would give him tasks like, why don't you read all the cards that came in this week from family and friends? why don't you talk to your dad about how the Packers are doing? You know, he grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. All those Wisconsin cheeseheads, they're big Packers fans. And I always joke that my kids were brainwashed. They should be 49ers fans in California, but they were Packers fans. And so Wesley would talk to him about how the season was looking. And I told him, tell him about what new restaurants you've tried. So just prompting him and helping him make conversation with his dad, who really just was wrapped up like a mummy. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think going back to your question about what were the early days like, it was just sort of shocking to see your loved one wrapped up like that, completely covered and not able to say or do anything.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure too, you know, the fact that you did get a phone call from him probably helped ease a little bit, because you're like, oh, he called me. Yes, this is serious, but I talked to him. And then compared to when, you know, you see him wrapped up, I'm able to, that's a harsh, you know, change.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, you know, obviously I know a little bit more because I did, you know, get to read your book and learn more about your journey, Jenny, but could you just kind of share with our listeners a little bit about Mark's hospital stay? I know we kind of started talking a little bit about it, but, you know, what that stay was like, and, you know, talking about, you know, kind of holding on to hope, but living in reality, and how you've separated the two, how you lived in them together. And if you could just share a little bit more about that.
Well, it's a great question. It's something I've thought a lot about. First of all, you know, it was a miracle that Mark survived the plane crash. So I feel like there were miracles that happened early on. What happened was, and maybe should I just tell listeners a little bit about what happened to Mark in his plane accident so that we can kind of talk about the hope part. What happened was his plane engine, he reported rough running engine 11 minutes after takeoff from Scottsdale Airport, and then declared emergency a few minutes later. And they directed him to a local suburban airport, but he wasn't going to make it. So he was trying to emergency land on a 2-lane road, but there were 3 cars. And so to avoid hitting them, he swerved to the right. And because he lost balance, because he didn't have engine power, the right wing clipped 2 light poles, and the fuel tanks are in the wings of small engine planes. And so it caught on fire. He hit a concrete barrier with the plane and landed upside down on the side of the road. And so everything was in flames. And what happened was when he made it to the Arizona Burn Center, I think the doctor, when I look back now, was trying to tell me nicely that Mark might not make it within the first 2 weeks. And I think I was holding on to hope because I felt like, gosh, he survived. He could have died out there if there was a good Samaritan who actually rescued him out of the plane. I forgot to mention that. And by the way, the Good Samaritan said to me, Thomas Honeycutt, who is now family, he said, when I was running out to rescue Mark, he said, I thought I won't be able to pull him out if he still got his seatbelt on. And when he got there to the cockpit window and it was cracked open, he said, literally, his seatbelt melted off his body right in front of him. And he was able to pull him out on the first try. So I already felt like we had that miracle. And then I think probably I didn't completely comprehend what the doctor was trying to tell me. And he said, you know, every decade of age, your mortality risk goes up, right? And Mark was 85% 3rd degree burned. So back to the topic of hope, I think that started to give me hope. And then my personal definition now, by the way, is hope is not expectation, but a belief in possibilities. And the doctors at the Burn Center modeled that for me. That's where I learned that. So I'll give you an example. When Mark had what they thought was going to be a fatal fungal infection that they wouldn't be able to treat internally, they said there are 3 scenarios for Mark. 1, he gets better, and that's what we hope for. He takes a turn for the best. The second scenario is the infection spreads and we have to amputate his arms, and that could be a downward spiral. Or third, it spreads to an organ and he dies. And the amazing thing was, the first scenario happened. He survived that fungal infection. They didn't think he was going to make it another 3 to 4 days. And so to me, that's hope, right? That's an example of hope, where you don't expect it to be better, but you can hope. And to know that there are options and possibilities, and to never close the door to possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jill, kind of thinking of that hope, from a provider side, how do you support, families kind of navigating that? Obviously, you do want them to be hopeful, and like Jenny said, you think, after the plane crash, you survived the worst of it, you made it to the hospital, but that's only the beginning of the healing. So how do you balance that, hope and uncertain outcomes?
And that's a really good point. And my philosophy always was to not crush someone's hope, not give people false expectations, or, but really support them. And, and I had hope things all over my office.
Mm-hmm.
I would give families hope rocks, just to as a awareness of hope. And as you mentioned, Rachel, there's so much uncertainty, and burn length of stays are very long. And so, and it's up and down. So I think, first of all, the family and the patient has to trust the team. And trust isn't given, it's earned. So I think by the team being consistent, having really good communication skills, and just if we have a mishap, we own it. And again, that trust between families is key. And knowing that we're going to help them get through this, and offering them tools, hooking them up to talk to other burn survivor families, wives talking to wives, or parents talking to children. And so it is, and I think also painting a realistic picture that there's going to be ups and downs through the whole hospitalization, and might take a couple steps forward and 3 back.
Yeah, I love what Jill said about other burn survivors. I wanted to just say a lot about that, because that gave me hope, Jill. Some of the survivors and their partners were introduced to me by the Burn Foundation, and others were just people I happened to coincidentally meet at the Burn Center. So 3 stories come to mind. They were all people that really had drive in life, real perseverance to begin with. One guy, Boyd Smith and Dee, he had a partial leg and a partial arm because of a congenital birth defect, and was already a rodeo rider. And so I thought, man, this guy's got gumption, right? And then he was in a house fire that burned 90% of his body. And the fact that he was alive and thriving and talking to me with his wife about what rehab could look like and what Mark was in for gave me a lot of hope. Mark Haley, who was a drag car race driver who had a freak accident. I remember his story. I met him at a conference briefly where he said, when I left residential rehab, I had them play the song Don't Look Back by Boston. And then Isabella McCune, who was 11 years old and 65% burned from a fire pit accident, 9-10 months at the burn center. And they didn't mince words in terms of what she went through. It was really, really hard, and she had setbacks. But I thought to myself, if an 11-year-old can get through this, surely Mark can. And Mark had a lot of grit and determination in his personality. So I think because he was always a fighter, that gave me hope talking to those burn survivors.
Yeah. Well, and I know, Jenny, too, you, in your book, you mentioned, some of the nurses and therapists who really impacted, those days in the hospital for you, not only Mark. So can you talk a little bit too about, not just the survivor community, but that burn care team and how they've really shaped, your journey?
Yeah. I mean, I'm getting teary-eyed and emotional because they became my second family. You know, because I was from California, the accident happened in Arizona. I rented an Airbnb near the hospital so I could be there every day for 5 months or more. And the nurses cared so much. I mean, you know, it's not everyone, but enough of them cared and really took the personal time to get to know us as a family. What they said to me was, a lot of us chose to do this work in ICU because we could spend time with the patient and really get to know the families, as opposed to an ER where people come and go. Some had a burn injury in their family, and so they really had a mission around wanting to be a nurse to help others go through what their dad went through or what their brother went through. So there was a real commitment from them. And I got to know them as people. You know, it was friendship, because it's so intense when you're there, and they're working, at least at the burn center we were at 3-day, 12-hour shifts. And so I was seeing them morning, noon, and night. And I myself was there 8 hours a day, right? So you spend a lot of time together in a little hospital room. And I learned about their hopes and fears and dreams, and related a lot to a lot of parents, you know, who were raising children, and mine were older. And we talked a lot about raising families and kids and what that's like. And so we just really got to know each other. The other thing I was going to say is music always played a big role in our life, Mark and I. He sang in a Bach choral society. I was never a creator of music. I have a okay voice, but I love music. I'm an appreciator of music. And we had playlists going, you know, meditation music or quiet music when Mark was going through a rough time after surgery. And we also had his rock playlist as well as my favorites. And we always had them on rotation. The nurses said, you know, we really got to know you through your playlists as well, right? Mm. And it lifted their day too, to have music while it could be a really grueling shift. And so, you know, for example, one nurse went to a Mumford concert because she knew that Mark loved Mumford, and she took videos and sent to us, and, you know, was trying to show him, you know, she showed him the video, even though he was in a coma. Like, look, Mark, went to a Mumford concert. Oh, I heard from Jenny, this is your favorite song. So it was very personal. And they did a good balance, though, Jill, of not trying to set unrealistic expectations, but creating such a human touch to how much they cared about our family. And I still get teary-eyed thinking about how grateful I am to all of them, because they are incredibly competent, incredibly resilient to be able to do the work they do in ICU and to keep our loved ones alive, quite frankly, every day, every minute. They're on the top of my most admired list now, truly. And so I also wrote the book to also acknowledge the nurses, the therapists, and the doctors in burn ICU. It's not an easy job.
It's certainly not. You know, they really are the, you know, healthcare heroes, you know, and like you said, they really do become a family.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the admiration.
Yeah.
Oh, Go ahead. Sorry. I was going to say, and the admiration's mutual, because as a burn care professional, we have patients that we will never, we'll never forget them. We'll take them to our grave. That made such an impact on how we could do things better for the next family. But just it impacts all of our lives. And so it called the Mutual Admiration Club because the patients inspire us to be better, to do better, and continue to doing good work.
Yeah. Well, you know, they say that burn is the worst trauma a human being can suffer, right? And so it takes a lot, right? I mean, I've talked to survivors, just the journey they've been on.
Yes.
Like you mentioned, you know, from survivors, loved ones, caregivers, you know, it's an emotional roller coaster for everyone kind of in this healing journey. And, you know, Jenny, I know you talk a little bit about that in your book as well, but, you know, in terms of caring for yourself through all of this, do you have, you know, any tips or advice for other
Yeah.
caregivers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think taking care of yourself is really important. I learned early on in the journey that we were running a marathon. It was a marathon. I didn't know when we were ever going to leave the burn center. And, by the end, towards the last third of the skin grafts for Mark, I knew it was going to be maybe a total of 9 or 10 months at that point, right, to get through everything. And so I think it's really important that caregivers and families take the time to eat properly, exercise, get enough sleep, just take care of yourself, have compassion for yourself. I think it's very easy to fall into oh, I feel guilty that my loved one is suffering in ICU, and why should I even bother taking care of myself? Well, you got to do it for your loved one, because if you have to make medical decisions and decisions about their health and their well-being, you've got to be on and able to do that in a good state of mind, or enough of a state of mind to be able to handle it. It's the old saying, right? Put the oxygen mask on yourself before you help your children. I think it definitely applies here. I took a leave from work because that was the only way I could be in Arizona every day with Mark. And I did find, because they were always doing the dressing change in the morning, first thing, that was a really good quiet time for me to take care of my own stuff, to exercise, to eat a good breakfast, pack a lunch to bring to the hospital, do all those things I need to do, pay bills, life, right? Work out. And so it's helpful to have a routine. And I think feeling empowered to ask a lot of questions, the nurses, the therapists, the doctors were all very helpful in that way. And it helped to just have a lot of information about what was going on, what the risks were, what was happening. And that roller coaster is really, there are times when you're in survival, and then there are times when you're just trying to make progress on skin grafts. And I always hoped and prayed we could get going and make progress on the skin grafts, because in my mind, that was my mental timeline for recovery, right? That felt like, now we're covering him with his own skin, and that's healing and not survival. But it's up and down, as you know. Right.
Definitely.
Sleep, I was going to say, sleep was hard. I mean, I think it's true for everyone when you're under stress. And so I had a guided meditation app that was my constant companion at home, where I could listen to waves on the beach, or, listen to river flowing. And I took a lot of naps. So
we love a good nap when we need it.
yes.
Jill, from a professional side, if you see a loved one or a caregiver who isn't able to find that routine, or is kind of struggling to, obviously they want to take care of the survivor, and they don't want to, taking care of themselves is not a priority. What tips or advice would you share to kind of get them to take that time that they need?
Yeah, and sometimes just giving them permission to go home, say, we will call you. And again, I think it goes back to that trust. We will call you if something changes. Giving them permission, because as Jenny mentioned, the guilt, sometimes people, loved ones feel like they have to be at the bedside, but you can't be at the bedside 24 hours and not take care of yourself. So I would also say this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. So you have to take care of yourself, because your loved one is going to depend on you to be healthy and able to take care. And they're going to need you. But we have a whole team of a whole burn team here watching out. So I think when families trusted their burn team, it was easier to go home. Did it work every time? No. But I think those relationships are key. And again, just following the patient's lead. Some days it was not a good day, and I knew I was not going to get this loved one to be able to go home because too many things were happening. But there are some days where it's okay. Go take a walk. Go get some coffee. I will call you, I promise. And they knew I would call. So I think it just goes to those relationships and trust building.
I love that. Well, Jenny, I do want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about your upcoming book, Forever Fly Free. It's coming out in October. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the book's coming out October 14th. I'm really excited about it. I wrote it because I had, during the burn center time, poured my heart out in a care community online with friends and family. I was a really private person before Mark had the accident. And because I was away from home, away from what was familiar, away from friends and family, and it was just Adrian and I, it went from posting medical updates to me pouring my heart out online and about my relationship with Mark and the love we shared and how I had hoped we would get back to that again, our life together. And I think it created a real, I don't know, like a virtuous circle of love and support, because then other people opened up in our community. And then before I knew it, Adrian said, Mom, did you know there are over 500 people on this online platform? And it turns out they're forwarding your posts every day and multiple posts every day to their faith communities to pray for Dad and to provide support to Dad. And then you layer on the nurses and how wonderful they were when I was at the burn center. It just felt like there was just this wonderful, like we tapped into this wonderful community of love and support all around. And it caused even Mark's Stanford Business School student classmates, who you think might be cold-hearted people, right? Business people. It became a catalyst for them to talk about deeper subjects among themselves and about health scares that they had had, because now they were all in their 50s and 60s, right? Different than when you're a hard-charging MBA at 25. And they also really admired the courage of Thomas Honeycutt and Mark. And so that part of the story of what happened really inspired them. And so it just had this sort of ripple effect, I think. And so when Mark died, I had a number of people at his memorial service say to me, Jenny, you've got to write a book. You've got to write a book because your posts are really inspiring. And we think that if you could write something that could really help other people going through painful times, it may not be as tragic as what you went through with Mark, and it may not involve as much suffering, but people will say, gee, if she could get through this and thrive again, how could I not figure out a way to do that as well, right? Like, what can I learn from her story? And so I really wasn't ready the first 2 years. I mean, I was in a dark place. It was a shock, and I had cognitive dissonance about, where did Mark disappear to? It's what happens when someone dies suddenly. And even though he was doing really well with skin grafts, and we were at the start of the last third of his skin grafts, he contracted an infection that was resistant to antibiotics and died within 24 hours. So because that happened so suddenly, I was really in shock the first year. And it took time to work through that. And so I think after 2 years, I had been working on my novel. Remember that thing that I started 10 years ago? And I suddenly felt compelled to get going on writing the memoir and the book. Things were starting. I went through a lot of personal growth during that time. And I just felt like there was enough to say that could be meaningful and helpful to others. And so I put the novel on the back burner and pretty much wrote the book, the Forever Fly Free, like in a year. Like, it just flowed out of me. Yeah, it was fast.
Yeah.
And so what I'm excited to say about the book is it's not so easy to find a publisher when you're a debut author like me, but all the pieces somehow fell into place. And I found an agent, and the agent introduced me to Regalo Press, which turned out to be a philanthropic division of Post Hill Publishing. And it couldn't have been a better match. I didn't even know it existed, that it could be philanthropic, which is that they said, we're willing to donate some of the proceeds of the book sales to the charity or nonprofit of your choice. And so that's why I named Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors as sort of the organization to receive some of the funds that they receive for the sale of the book. And so I'm really excited about that, in terms of the do-good part of what the book can bring.
Definitely. And we're so excited and grateful for that opportunity as well. And I also wanted to share with our listeners who are listening before the book comes out. So if you order your copy of Forever Fly Free before October 14th, you can get 10% off with the code PSBS. And that's at foreverflyfree.com. So it's on our screen if you're watching us right now. We'll make sure we have that in our show notes as well. So it's a great opportunity for you to save a little, and you're supporting not only you, Jenny, but also Phoenix Society. So we're really excited for you to have that book come out.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, it is available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and Target, but you wouldn't be able to use the code. So use it on the website that Rachel mentioned, and that definitely will take.
Yes.
So.
Well, you talked about, after those 2 years, you were ready to write this book. Were there any parts that, you did write it pretty quick in a year's fast, but were there any parts that were, particularly difficult for you to write or read back?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up, yes. And by the way, I ended up seeing a therapist during that time. I didn't feel the need for it in the beginning. I joined a spouse partner grief support group. But it was a little hard because everybody else lost their loved one to cancer or an illness, and I was the only one who lost someone to a traumatic burn injury. But I felt that when I had to replay my experience, it was going to be tough. And so my therapist really helped me through that. And I think the hardest time was when I had to write the scene when Mark died. And the rest of that story before is so full of hope and a belief in possibilities and miracles. And I think it was just sort of a shock when he didn't make it. And I think writing about that, especially when I had to call my son, my 23-year-old son, to now tell him that his father died the way my mom had to call me when I was 23. I'm sorry, he was 23. That was a really tough moment in the process of writing the book. I think after he passed and when I got through that first 2 years, it was easier to write about that because then I was coming out of the grief and beginning to heal and found love again.
I know you write about too that, some people spiral and get stuck, especially after grief. Why do you, what was it like for you to, find love, find joy, survive and thrive again after a major loss? Why do you think some people struggle with that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I've thought about it a lot. I think at some point, the turning point for me was recognizing that there's no guarantee in life. There are no guarantees. And to understand that life is constantly evolving, dynamic, and changing, and that while bad things happen to me, good things can happen too, right? And I think people who struggle sometimes just can't get out of that negative cycle, that they've lost hope. They've lost hope that something great could happen again in their life. So I feel that as long as I always know that there's the good things and the bad things, and that I came out of this okay, gives me hope that whatever happens to me, I can find a way to be okay, right? And I think that helps. And I think having a reason, a meaningful reason to live your life is really important, whether it's a sense of purpose or mission, or that you have to do it for your kids or your family, right? I felt like in my grief support group, there were 5 of us, and the 2 of us that had children probably worked through our grief a little faster because we had to be there for our kids, even if they were in their 20s. And we saw a lot of our partners in our kids, right? So we felt like the legacy continued through our kids. There was a sense of continuity. I think it's hard when you don't have a purpose or a feeling of legacy with the loved one, your loved one who died or who suffered.
Yeah. And how does that feel, writing your memoir, sharing, so much about Mark's journey and your healing journey and your grief journey. How does that feel that, you are continuing on Mark's legacy by publishing this book and by helping others? How does that feel?
Yeah, it feels really good. I mean, it's a big part of why I feel this is meaningful for me. He was a huge mentor to people. He loved people. He was probably the most extroverted introvert I knew. And I feel like I'm carrying forward his legacy around helping others, right? Because he cared a lot about helping a lot of people. And God knows he had a ton of energy. He was the Energizer Bunny. And I feel like by writing a book, this is an easier way for me to get the word out. I don't have his energy to like talk to tons and tons of people, but at least the book is a path forward for doing that. And I also think he showed a lot of courage with what he did. And when I hear from eyewitnesses of what happened that day, the woman who was in the first car of the 3 cars that he nearly hit but avoided by turning, she said literally they locked eyes. And she saw him coming and she thought she was going to die. She thought she was going to die in that moment. And she saw him suddenly just turn the plane to the right and get out of her way. And she said it's changed her life forever. And so I think there's so many stories of courage here, not only Thomas Honeycutt, but Mark's actions of that day that I want people to know about, right? And to be inspired by as well, because that was a lot of who he was.
Definitely. Well, Jenny, I know we are coming up on our time and we didn't have a ton of time today to talk really specifically about your grief journey. So we're definitely going to have you come back on our show to talk a little bit more about that. But, before, we always ask our listeners 2 final questions. But before we do that, is there anything else you want to share with our listeners? And Jill, I'll also open it up to you as well if there's anything else you want to share with us as well today.
I think the one thing I would say is now more than 5 years later since Mark's accident, I'm still going through healing. And I think for anyone who's a caregiver or burn survivor, it's ongoing work, right? And whatever demons you were wrestling with before the accident or before what happened to you, you got to keep on working on those things, right? Because it affects your resilience. And, one example, and I just wanted to say this, that I discovered recently that my nervous system was stuck in fight or flight. And Mark's accident didn't help me. And I learned a lot about how I have a great need to be strong and maybe too strong. And I've been doing work on myself to kind of overcome that because I didn't realize how disconnected I'd gotten from my body. So I also want to caution caregivers who feel that they've got to be there for their loved one, that to have compassion for yourself. You have to have compassion for yourself and to understand that you went through big trauma as well, even though you are not the survivor per se. And that there can be things like PTSD and other kinds of symptoms that are easy to ignore because everybody's focus is on the survivor in your family, right? So I just wanted to say that it's important to have compassion for yourself as caregivers.
Definitely.
Yeah. And that is so spot on, giving yourself some grace. And, just thank you. I just want to thank you for sharing your story because you've inspired me. And I'm sure anyone that's going to hear your story is going to be so inspired by your grace and your humility and your vulnerability. So I just personally want to thank you.
Thank you, Jill. And thank you for everything you do through the Phoenix Society. I think it's tremendous work you're all doing.
Thank you. We really appreciate that. Well, like I did mention, we always ask our guests 2 final quick questions. We did talk a little bit about this one already, but Jenny, what's one thing that does give you hope when things feel heavy?
Oh, I think one thing I learned through all the trauma I've been through with Mark is to learn to be still and quiet inside, and to find and to trust your inner voice. However you interpret that. For some, it's hearing from God. From others, it's hearing from your intuition. For others, it's simply your inner voice. And I think I came out of this really learning to trust myself and my intuition. And I really just encourage everybody to believe that you've got that in you, that you know more than you realize if you just take the time to pay attention to what you're feeling and hearing.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it is time for our final question, which is our Phoenix Partner question today, sponsored by the Burt Martin Foundation. So their question is, I'm going to change it a little bit, but what do you hope someone who reads your book feels or learns?
That everything in life is a teacher, and we don't ask for the tragedy that happens to us, but that it makes us stronger. And as I said earlier, that one can learn to trust yourself, to know what to do, and to how to navigate through tough times. If you just take the time to listen and to be quiet and to get away from the distractions and the busyness of life, that we have it, all of us have it in us to find that strength.
We do.
Yeah.
Well, just as a reminder to our listeners, if you go visit foreverflyfree.com and use the code PSBS, you can save 10% off Jenny's book if you order but before October 14th. So definitely check that out. And Jenny, can you remind us where else the book is available? I know you said Amazon.
Yeah, it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and Target.
Perfect. So we'll have all of those links in our show notes. So be sure to check out Spotify or Apple Podcasts for those links. And I just want to thank you again, Jenny, so much for joining the podcast today.
All right. Thank you so much, Rachel and Jill. It was great to have this time with you. And I am part of that Mutual Admiration Society that Jill mentioned.
I love that.
Cuts both ways.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Awesome.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Girls with Grafts. If you are enjoying this content, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.